Now some of the details, beginning with the military campaign against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Gwen Eiffel has that story.
3 weeks ago, Pentagon officials proclaimed U.S. planes were running out of targets in Afghanistan. Taliban positions, they said, had been eviscerated. No one is talking that way anymore. At today's Pentagon briefing, the questions were all about the spotty air war, civilian casualties, and impatient U.S. allies in the Islamic world. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld counseled patience.
As we've said from the start of the campaign, this will not happen overnight. It is a marathon, not a sprint. It will be years, not weeks or months. The Americans, as you know, do not seek war. We did not seek this war. It was thrust upon us. It is something, as we said, that is more akin to draining the swamp bit by bit.
Today was day 23 of the campaign, a campaign filled with reports of mistakes and miscalculations rather than news of progress. On Friday, 8 large U.S. bombs hit an International Red Cross warehouse in Kabul for the second time in 2 weeks. The Pentagon's explanation: human error. The Pentagon has also acknowledged dozens of unintended civilian deaths and injuries, and the death toll from bombs gone astray has continued to mount. Eyewitnesses today said 13 people were killed when U.S. planes aiming for Taliban soldiers north of Kabul instead hit homes nearby. The United Nations reported that American airstrikes in the western city of Herat landed on a hospital and a residential village. At least 9 people were killed. The Pentagon said it is investigating, but the U.S. has already admitted that it mistakenly killed 4 civilians near an airport in Kabul and 4 others when an errant bomb hit a United Nations mine removal facility. Rumsfeld said today the Taliban has inflated many of the casualty reports, but they are ultimately to blame, he said, for any collateral damage.
We did not start the war. The terrorists started it. So let there be no doubt. Responsibility for every single casualty in this war, be they innocent Afghans or innocent Americans, rests at the feet of Taliban and al-Qaeda. There has never been a conflict where people have not been killed, and this is the case here. There is ordnance flying around from 3 different sources. It's flying around from us from the air down, it's flying around from the al-Qaeda and the Taliban up that lands somewhere and kills somebody when it hits. And there's opposition forces and al-Qaeda forces that are engaged and shooting at each other. Now, in a war, that happens. There is nothing you can do about it. We lost 5,000 people in this country, plus. And we need to stop people, terrorists, from doing that.
Still, the Pentagon has dispensed with all talk of eviscerating the enemy. One senior official said last week that the Taliban may be tougher to remove than first believed.
They are proven to be tough warriors. We're in an environment they obviously are experts in, and it is extremely harsh. I am a bit surprised at how doggedly they're hanging on to power.
The large-scale Taliban defections the U.S. had hoped for have yet to materialize. That effort dealt another blow last week when Abdul Haq, a prominent opposition leader, was caught and killed. A CIA plane sent to rescue him arrived too late. A delicate coalition with Arab nations is also in danger, as Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf continues to press Washington to end the bombing before the Muslim holy month of Ramadan begins in 3 weeks.
During the month of Ramadan, one needs to, United States will have to evaluate, because it might, prolongation of the operation into that month will have negative effects around the Islamic world.
Egypt has also signaled its desire for a quick campaign. A chief aide to President Hosni Mubarak said heavy U.S. bombing during Ramadan would be an affront to the world's Muslims. Rumsfeld did not appear to yield on that point today.
The history of warfare is that it has proceeded right through Ramadan, year after year after year after year. The Northern Alliance fought the Taliban for the last 5+ years. Middle East wars have gone on during Ramadan. There have been any number of conflicts between Muslim countries and between Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries throughout Ramadan.
The White House said today the president would meet with Musharraf next week in New York. The pace of the war is certain to be on the agenda. For more on how the military campaign is going, we turn to three who have been watching closely. General Merrill McPeak was Air Force Chief of Staff during the Gulf War. He is now chairman of ECC International Corporation, which produces training and simulation equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters, who retired from the Army in 1998, was Emerging Threats Officer for Army Intelligence. He is the author of a number of books, including Fighting for the Future, Will America Triumph? And William Hartung is a fellow at the New School University's World Policy Institute in New York. He's the author of the forthcoming book, The Changing Dynamics of U.S. Defense Policy and Budgeting in the Post-Cold War Era. Welcome, everybody. Colonel Peters, how would you say the military campaign is going right now?
Well, I think the military campaign is going about as well as we could expect. This is a new kind of war. We didn't have a formula, and you have to learn as you go. At present, we're still fighting taking the Bill Clinton approach to warfare. We'll evolve beyond it. We're finding out what air power can and cannot do in this area, and it will take time, but I think we will definitely get the combinations right. It's really a matter of time, Gwen.
What do you mean when you say the Bill Clinton approach to warfare?
Well, still trying to do as much as you can from a distance, standoff, sterile, low casualties. We're a superpower that's still thinking small. Our strength, our wealth, our raw power is our greatest advantage. Not our entertainment media, not our moral force even. Raw power. And we have to use it, and in time we will.
General McPeak, are we thinking too small?
Well, Gwen, that's a nice question and well posed by Mr. Peters. Limited war is a concept we all talk about without thinking much about what we mean. You can limit wars in a lot of ways. You can limit it by geography, by objectives, by munitions used. But the hardest way to limit is in time. It's not impossible. The Blitzkrieg was an example of a style of fighting in which the attempt was made to limit in the dimension of time. But it's very hard to do. No one said at the start of the war on terrorism that we're going to do this for 3 weeks and then declare a victory and walk away from it. Especially something like the war on terrorism is going to take a long time.
Are we even where we were supposed to be after 3 weeks?
It's hard to judge at this distance if we are where we're supposed to be on every level, because we have objectives here at several different levels. Tactically, we seek to bring bin Laden's head back in a paper bag, and we certainly haven't done that yet. At the operational level, we seek to change the government to replace the Taliban with someone, and there, maybe the hardest part is figuring out who we want to replace them with. But the progress there is certainly uneven. At the most important level, which is the strategic level, we seek to deter other countries from harboring terrorists. And there we achieved our objectives immediately. It is now obvious that attacking the United States is not a no-cost maneuver. And so, at some level, we're exactly where we should be.
Mr. Hartung, how do you assess if we're where we should be?
Well, I think we have the whole thing backwards. Secretary Rumsfeld said at the outset there are very few high-value targets in Afghanistan. The Taliban is probably stronger than they were 3 weeks ago, just because of the sort of rally around the flag effect of large-scale bombing. We're starting more and more to see civilian casualties, which is going to weaken our position internationally, which is going to make it difficult for some members of the coalition, particularly Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. And I haven't seen any great military benefit of all this. If we really want to do this properly, I think the military tactics should be part of the mix, not the primary mission. I think we have to look harder to international diplomacy, to cutting off funds, to leaning on some of our allies like Saudi Arabia, who haven't even dealt with some of their own citizens, who are helping to foster some of this activity. And I think we have to do more on the home front. 6 weeks after September 11th, we still don't have any kind of upgrade of our airport security system worth the name. So I think.
But Mr. Hartung, how do you respond to what General McPeak just said, that critics like you basically are jumping the gun, that this wasn't supposed to happen in 3 weeks?
Well, it depends which day you hear the administration. It wasn't so long ago that they said they thought they could wrap this up before Ramadan, meaning that they would have some sort of, bin Laden captured, the Taliban falling, large-scale defections. The administration has sort of been speaking out of both sides of its mouth on this. Optimism on some days, other days they're talking about a, year-long or years-long effort. So I think part of what we're seeing is that they're really kind of, to a large degree, making this up as they go along. And, it's a fine line between tactical flexibility and winging it. And I think in some cases they've crossed that line.
Colonel Peters, I see you shaking your head, so I'll allow you to respond, but I also am curious about the point that he just made about the degree to which civilian casualties begin to undermine the effort.
I think that's a red herring. Gwen, first of all, cowardice is never a good strategy. 5,000 Americans died on September 11th. The Taliban can call me back when the civilian casualties approach 5,000, or for that matter, 50,000. We are dealing not with a theoretical construct. We are dealing with evil. Now that word's thrown around a lot, but there is evil in the world. We are dealing with enemies who, if they could, would be glad to kill all of us. I mean, we Americans still don't understand the depth of hatred in the world. And this frankly is a kill them or they kill us. And that is not an exaggeration. As far as the Taliban being stronger than it was 3 weeks ago, I think that's just plain wrong. We're deconstructing their ability to wage 20th century war. We'll be able to take them back into about the 19th century, but they will still have strength of will. Part of the problem is the hardcore killers, the Arab religious mercenaries, bin Laden's Foreign Legion, and the hardcore terrorists have no place else to go. They will fight to the end. Their backs are against the wall. But casualties, we just have to obviously never be wanton in killing them. But Secretary Rumsfeld is actually absolutely right. You can't wage sterile warfare. And for the greater good of not only the United States, not only the West, but humanity, we must carry this campaign not over 3 weeks, but over 3 years, and if necessary, 30.
General McPeak, as an Air Force man, what do you think of the air campaign so far, and do you think that it inevitably has to move to something else?
No, I don't think there's any inevitability about doing anything beyond what we're doing. It's really kind of a low level of effort, low sortie rate. We haven't had any losses, any combat losses that I know about, so there's no reason to think we can't continue this indefinitely. But remember, Gwen, I recall during our last air campaign into Kosovo, which lasted, just over a couple months, that it was routinely on this program denounced as a failure from about day 3 on. And now we've got Milosevic in the Hague facing a court. So just because we don't achieve a knockout in the first few seconds of round 1 doesn't mean that we have to throw up our hands and declare failure.
So should the air war continue even during Ramadan?
Well, I think our style of fighting should require that we keep more or less constant pressure on the opposition. Now, we've tried to be as circumspect as possible. We have had some civilian casualties. A lot of bad things happen in war. That's the nature of the beast. But my view is we ought to continue to keep a constant 24-hour, 7-day-a-week pressure on these guys.
I'd like to respond to that.
Certainly. Mr. Hartung?
It seems to me what Mr. Peters said earlier about if there's 5,000, if there's 50,000 civilian casualties, basically is lowering us to the level of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The point is, we have to do what's most effective. If I thought bombing Afghanistan was the most effective way to disrupt the network of Al-Qaeda, I would say fine. But the fact of the matter is, the more we step up the bombing, the more we use cluster bombs, the more we take actions that are supposed to get at the Taliban, Al-Qaeda networks, the more we're going to be killing civilians. And that's going to be a recruiting poster for bin Laden and groups like his in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Pakistan, and it's not going to achieve our aim. So it's not a question of who's a coward and who's not. It's a question of fighting this in a smart way. And terrorism cannot be solved simply by military means. If you have a needle in a haystack and you bomb the haystack, you haven't accomplished anything. I think we need a much more subtle strategy where military force is used when we have clear intelligence and we can take out parts of this network, not just bombard the country and hope for the best.
Well, do we have, Colonel Peters, do we have that intelligence right now?
No, certainly we have an intelligence system that's still structured for the Cold War. And our intelligence system has to evolve as the military has to evolve, as the government has to evolve. But the greatest recruiting poster or the greatest recruiting tool for the Taliban, for Al-Qaeda, would be our failure. We must succeed. Now, again, no one wants wanton killing of civilians. We must always be judicious. But this is a war. And what I hear from Mr. Hartung is the wisdom of the campus, where life is very safe and clean, and you can have your debates in the faculty lounge. This is real life. Americans have died, more will die.
Let me ask you a question about that. One of the things when we talk about intelligence, when we talk about what happens next, is what happens with a post-Taliban government. Now, the conversation has shifted from that because we're not so certain that the Taliban is going anywhere for a while. But with the death of Abdul Haq and the assassination of Ahmed Massoud earlier, doesn't that make it a much tougher road to hoe to do what we said we went in there to do?
Well, what we went in there to do was to get bin Laden, Omar, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda. And we've got to focus on that. What I do worry about is the arrogance of Washington, and the West as well, in imagining that we can design a better government for Afghanistan. We don't have the nuanced knowledge or the subtlety. We don't understand that area of the world. They've got to design their own government. What we need to do is focus on destroying those men and organizations that have killed Americans and want to kill Americans. The rest can come later.
And I want to get back to General McPeak in a moment, but first, Mr. Hartung, I want to give you a chance to respond to the Ivory Tower allegation.
Well, I think if we polled the faculty at most American universities, they'd be closer to Mr. Peters' view than mine. The point is, what's the most effective approach? And again, as was mentioned, we don't have a political strategy for Afghanistan. We don't want the Northern Alliance running that country. We don't want the king who hasn't been there in 27 years running the country. So, if we basically just bomb the country, create chaos, it's going to be just as good an environment for terrorism as it was before, and we're not going to have to solve anything. If anything, we should be going back to the United Nations, perhaps during a bombing pause, and getting more specific authorization for what we're doing over there, so it's clear that this is a very special case. They killed thousands of civilians. That government deserves to be taken out of power, but I think we have to do it in an effective way, and this campaign has not been effective.
Let me let General McPeak respond to that briefly. What about the idea of a bombing pause?
Well, look, Gwen, this operation is going about as you might expect. It's been limited in many ways, and especially in time, because it's only gone on for 3 weeks. I do agree that the military dimension is probably the least difficult. The harder jobs are the political and diplomatic jobs, the tasks that have to be done on those fronts. But from a military standpoint, this is going about as you should expect.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, more ferment and instability in Pakistan, a nation bordering Afghanistan. We start with a report from Andrea Catherwood of Independent Television News.
One by one, 15 in all, the white coffins with their red crosses were lined up outside St. Dominic's Church. Just yesterday, the dead were worshipping inside at a Sunday service when gunmen sprayed this sanctuary with automatic fire, killing 14 worshippers, their minister and a Muslim police officer trying to guard them. Today, 5,000 mourners arrived at the same church for their funerals. Among the dead, 5 from one family. A mother, a father, and their 3 children. Survivors told how they cowered under pews to escape the bullets, while the Catholic Bishop of Punjab preached the biblical principle of turning the other cheek and forgiving those who killed the Christians as they prayed. But under the symbol of the cross, a minority chanted for revenge. Blood for blood, they shouted, we will repay them in kind. No one has admitted carrying out the massacre, but security officials suspect a banned Islamic group. It's been deplored through much of Pakistan. Many Muslims have rallied round the tiny Christian community.
Every Pakistani, they are condemning this incident, and this is very, very tragic, unfortunate, and we all condemn it.
This is the worst Christian massacre in Pakistan's history.
More now from the New York Times correspondent in Islamabad, Pakistan, John Burns. Ray Suarez talked with him this afternoon.
John, let's start with that massacre of Christian worshippers. Do the authorities in Pakistan have any leads, any idea who might have done this?
Well, they left no calling cards, no surprise there. Some anecdotal evidence given to me in the church yesterday, a few hours after the massacre. The attackers were bearded, or at least 3 of the 6 of them were certainly bearded, long beards, which is in itself a kind of marker for Islamic militancy in this country. Interesting also that Bahawalpur, the city in the Indus River Valley where this occurred, is also the hometown of one of the most militant and I might say brutal of the Islamic militant leaders of Pakistan, Maulana Masood Azhar, who was blamed by the Indians recently for an attack on the legislature in Kashmir in which 40 people were died. That was about 3 weeks ago. So plenty of, if you will, circumstantial evidence pointing at Islamic militants.
Well, given the situation in Pakistan right now, why would Christians be a target?
In the best of times, Christians in Pakistan are a somewhat persecuted minority. There are about 2 million in a population of 140 million. And they have been targeted over the years, particularly in the years since the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan, which radicalized Islam in Pakistan. They've had their villages burned, and they've had their schools burned and destroyed. They've had their homes destroyed. This was different. This was the first time that armed men have gone into a church and committed a massacre of this kind. And the answer clearly lies across the border in Afghanistan. This was the immediate and universal assumption of everybody I met in the church yesterday after the massacre. One lady, a nurse, who had escaped the massacre by dint of visiting her parents yesterday morning instead of going regularly to church, said the Americans are attacking Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a Muslim country. America is a predominantly Christian country, and that makes us a target for revenge. That was, generally speaking, the view, and I don't think there's much doubt about that, and I think even the president of Pakistan, General Musharraf, has reached the same conclusion.
Returning to General Musharraf, he has said that Pakistan is in with the coalition till the bitter end, but seems to have more and more trouble on his hands as each week passes in the domestic scene.
He does indeed. He was a very nervous President Musharraf when he made this commitment about 5 days after the suicide hijackers hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. He's somewhat steadied the ship since then. He's reshuffled his army high command, which has meant his own position is a good deal more secure. I think it needs to be borne in mind that the trouble that there has been, and it has been widespread, has so far been confined mostly to the Islamic militant groups. They've managed to get thousands of people into the streets, as many as 50,000 on one occasion. These are not great crowds by Pakistani standards. In the elections, in the democratic days of Pakistan, it was common to see crowds of 1 million in the streets. I think what he fears is that this unrest amongst Islamic militants could spread into the general population if the bombing continues and if targeting errors and pilot errors continue to cause civilian deaths through what the Pentagon calls collateral damage. And that's why he's asking for a quick end to the bombing campaign.
Even though you appear to be agreeing with the general's notion that this is still a small minority of his countrymen coming out publicly in support of the Taliban, what about broader sympathy? Is there still a lot of feeling among rank-and-file Pakistanis that now it's starting to be a big power beating up on a small one?
You know, it's a very ambivalent thing, and it's something you find very widely in Pakistanis. They agree that, with some passion, that what happened on September the 11th was an outrage that any sovereign nation has to seek redress for. In that sense, sense, they understand the need for American military action in Afghanistan, and there's a general understanding that General Musharraf had not much choice but to support that. On the other hand, they are Muslims in the overwhelming majority, and they are worried about fellow Muslims dying as a result of a war which, in the case of all non-Taliban Afghans, they had nothing to do with.
John Burns from Islamabad, thanks a lot for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
Now another South Asian perspective on the war in Afghanistan, this one from the Muslims who live in India. Fred DeSam Lazaro of Twin Cities Public Television reports.
It's become a familiar sight across the Muslim world.
Osama bin Laden was a creation of America. Now he's turned against them, and they are crying. I think the whole thing is against Islam.
This demonstration was in Delhi, one of several held across India. India was an early supporter of the U.S. anti-terrorism campaign, a secular democracy, a non-Islamic nation with a substantial Islamic population. In numbers, India is one of the largest Muslim countries in the world. At 130 million, it's second only to Indonesia. More Muslims live here than in the entire Arab world. Many Indian Muslim leaders insist this fiery rhetoric reflects only a small minority of their community. Many Muslims, by choice or circumstance, remained in India in 1947 when the departing British partitioned it into two nations. These Muslims committed themselves to a secular nation instead of the new Islamic Republic of Pakistan, according to Salman Khurshid, an opposition Congress Party leader.
If their forefathers decided that they wanted to stay with 80% Hindus rather than 100% Muslims.
Meaning go to Pakistan.
Go to Pakistan. So if they've decided to stay here, it means they're liberal. It means that they want a secular country. It means they want a country that is not dominated by religion.
The fact that they are outnumbered 6-1 by Hindus may also influence Muslim politics. Author Kuldeep Nair adds India's Muslim population is also diffuse, spread across the country.
Diffuse, spread out, and also the attitude is not that fundamentalist, because after all, you are living in a different kind of society. You are not living in an Islamic state. You are living in a state which is non-Islamic, which is democratic, which is republic. And so your attitude cannot be the one which is, say, is prevalent in a purely Islamic state. Their Maulvis and Mullahs do go and foment that kind of idea, but it doesn't germinate it.
But moderate Islamic leaders complain these demonstrations hurt the often delicate Hindu-Muslim relations. Tensions have risen in recent years with the rise of Hindu nationalist parties, some allied with the ruling BJP government. The nationalists want a more Hindu, less secular India. The fundamentalist Islamic demonstrations play into the extremists' hands, making life difficult for moderates, according to Khurshid.
We get wrapped from the majority, saying, this is what your Muslims are saying. We come to their defense, we become targets ourselves. If we don't defend them, we become alienated from our community. They're destroying the basic links between the majority and the minority by taking these extreme positions in which they cannot achieve anything. And if they wanted to do this, they should just get together and go to Afghanistan and fight the Americans. They only make speeches in the streets in Delhi.
Many Indians see the US-led war on terrorism as a vindication of India's long-held position. 2 prime ministers have been assassinated and tens of thousands of Indian lives lost in various separatist conflicts, actions India labels as terrorism.
I only hope that after this, when this does settle down, that they will see that, look here, that terrorism, if it is allowed to breed in one country or at one place, is going to spread out. And this fundamentalism of any kind, of any religion, whether it is Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jew, that's not the thing, because it does not fit in into democracy.
Terrorism incidents on the subcontinent have not ceased since September 11th. On October 1st, 38 people died in a suicide bombing at the Legislative Assembly in Srinagar, capital of the disputed region of Kashmir, claimed both by India and Pakistan. A Pakistan-based group was implicated in the blast. The U.S. urged India not to respond militarily, but last week Indian forces attacked Pakistani positions across the Kashmir line of control. Muslim leader Khurshid says India resents being asked to stand by helplessly.
Somebody walks into your living room, you're told not beyond the doorstep. You can drive him out, not beyond the doorstep. And when the US is hit, it can cross 7 seas to hit the enemy. And why these double standards? Why the double standards? We are perturbed about Pakistan harboring terrorists who hit India. You know, everybody wants Osama. Nobody wants the people who've inflicted pain and injury to us. They are in Pakistan, they are in Sri Lanka, they are sitting in other places, and nobody is talking about them.
Ultimately, many here say the course and length of the American-led war on terrorism will determine if pro-Taliban rallies remain relatively small or whether they grow into a louder anti-American chorus in an India frustrated that the global war on terrorism doesn't target groups it has fingered as terrorist.
Now some closing thoughts this Monday evening, and to Margaret Warner.
And for those thoughts, we turn to 5 NewsHour regulars. 4 historian authors, Michael Beschloss, Doris Kearns-Goodwin, Richard Norton-Smith, and Roger Wilkins, and journalist author Haynes Johnson. Welcome back to you all. As we've explored earlier on the show tonight, there are real questions about how this war on terrorism is going, both abroad and here at home. Richard, beginning with you, are we, do you think, as a nation, in the state of mind we need to be to wage this war?
Well, you know, it's an interesting question. In some ways, obviously, demonstrably, we're not. I mean, if you look at what's happened, the tragic loss of the postal workers in the last couple of weeks, the threat caused by anthrax, the obsessive coverage, one might argue, that the media have given to that. But in a larger sense, I think if the question is, are we psychologically prepared because of the transforming events of September 11th to accept significant changes in how we live our lives and to commit ourselves to what the president has said is a different kind of war, a war that is not going to end in 3 weeks or because of 3 weeks of bombing, then I think the question is, yes, we are.
Doris, do you think we are?
Well, I think the problem is that I think we understand that it's going to be a long war, but it's hard for us to participate in that war in 1,001 ways the way we could in World War II. You could have hundreds of thousands joining the armed forces. They could go to the factories to make sure to get those ships, tanks, and weapons built. They could have victory gardens. They could feel, not simply as we're being told, go back to your ordinary lives. It's harder now. We don't have a draft in the same way we did. Although there's some indication, I'd like to believe that that younger generation will want to participate. My own youngest son, who just graduated from Harvard this June, has joined the military. He wants that 3-year commitment. He wants to be part of what this is all about. Instead of just going to work for a year and going to law school, he wants to be part of this. And I suspect there'll be a lot of others like that as well. But somehow you just keep wishing that the government would challenge us. Maybe we need a Manhattan Project for this antibiotics, vaccine production. We were able to get cargo ships down from 365 days in World War II to 1 day by the middle with that kind of collective enterprise. And I think we just need to be mobilized, our spirit, our productivity, much more than we were.
Haynes, you've been out traveling on a book tour. How do you find the state of Americans sort of psychologically?
It's the most extraordinary time I've ever seen, Margaret. On the surface, everything is wonderful. It looks just placid. It's a great fall. I've been all over the country, back and forth, crisscrossing it. People seem dressed well, placid, enjoying life. But then you talk to any single person, anywhere, at any age, at any point, and you get this disconnect. All of a sudden something comes out, this great apprehension. I don't agree with Richard that we're committed to something. We know our world has changed.
I'm sorry, you do or don't agree with Richard?
I don't agree with Richard. No, I don't agree with Richard that we are committed to something. We know it's changed. We don't know where it's going. This is there was a realization of the long term here. The apprehension, the fear, the nervousness, looking over your shoulder. People talk about their children, their jobs, their careers. They don't know what's going on. I don't mean to say they're fearful of running into the streets and all that, but there is deep apprehension just beneath the surface. And it makes the job of leadership very tough to mobilize, as Doris said, to reach the country with something that we can do. That's what no one knows. What are we supposed to do exactly? That hasn't come through yet. And I think it's very important.
Michael, what's your sense of this? Whether Americans, one, are really committed, and two, whether they have a clear sense of what they're committed to, what they're signing up for?
Well, I don't think we're going to have a problem feeling involved in this war, because there was a remarkable statement the other day by Vice President Cheney. He said that this could be a war in which we have more casualties domestically than we have abroad, implying that there will be further terrorist attacks of the kind that we heard a warning about from the Attorney General just earlier this evening. And if that happens, you're not going to have people feeling that they're disconnected from this war, because unlike World War II, this is something that could be really in every street. And the result is that as that happens, the good side is that in case anyone needs to be reminded why we should be patient about a victory in Afghanistan, if it takes a while, or anything else we're doing, we're going to be constantly reminded, either by those events or by simply fear, that unless we do this, unless we're patient, our lives could be very much poorer, and this could be a very different country.
Roger.
Well, this is so different from World War II that I think we're not really in a war mood. When we got into World War II, we knew how powerful and how effective the Nazi war machine was. We had proof, positive, of how determined and how resourceful the Japanese were. We knew we were in it for the long haul. We don't know what the long haul is here. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. And in the meantime, what are we called upon to do? It seems to me that one of the things we're called upon to do is to take care of the country. That is, to think really clearly about what it is that we value as a nation. And what makes us think that this is worth fighting for, and then go and make it stronger. People who flew planes into those two tall buildings really expect this democracy to implode the way those two tall buildings imploded. Democracy, you know, is perishable. We know that. You got to take care of it in order to make it endure. So it seems to me the challenge to us is to find ways now to make the democracy stronger, to protect the rights that we cherish, and to show our commitment that way until there's some other way that we can fight this war.
Richard, Haynes said he didn't agree with you that Americans knew what they were committed to. So respond to that. What do you think Americans think they're committing to?
I think there is so much that is improvised about this war, about this threat. I think you've seen that in the last few weeks in the government's effort, not always effective by any means, scrambling to deal with this unprecedented threat, but also, frankly, in the last few days, scrambling to deal with the media coverage of the threat. That is a very significant element that did not exist in World War II. I mean, Doris is absolutely right about the enormous mobilization of resources and spirit that took place in that war. But I think she would also concede, because she knows this much better than the rest of us, that the first weeks after Pearl Harbor were chaotic. It was a period of many setbacks. It was a terribly difficult period. If it was being broadcast 24 hours a day on cable news, I'm not sure what the impact would be. I saw one cable anchor last week begin his stint by asking, rhetorically one presumes, whether the postal workers had been killed by the CDC. I mean, this weekend we're hearing the word quagmire used. Now, everyone in this panel knows that is a word freighted with emotional and political and cultural significance arising out of the Vietnam War. It is not only patience that we need in this war, it is perspective. And when people talk about a quagmire after a 3-week bombing campaign, it suggests, if nothing else, they lack perspective.
Doris, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said today he thought the American public was more patient than the media or the elites. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think so far they have showed a certain patience. I think the problem, as Richard just said, is that it took 11 months in World War II before we had any real victory. It wasn't until the invasion of North Africa in November. And there was a lot of grumbling and griping. It's important to remember that. In fact, the Democrats lost a lot of seats in the Senate and the House in November, in part because coffee rationing had gone into effect right before the midterm elections, and it was 5 days before the invasion of North Africa, and people were being told they could only have 1 coffee a day. That seemed monumental. But in the midst of that grumbling and griping, there were things that the people could do. They didn't feel they were passively being asked to just lead an ordinary life. So I still think that the challenge for this administration is not simply to ask us for patience, not simply to ask us to go back to our ordinary lives, but to figure out creatively how to mobilize the best talent, the best creativity, the best energy, the best business leadership, the best pharmaceutical leadership, in teams perhaps, working across country lines, working across antitrust concerns, so that we're really in a war spirit at home. And then we'll feel that we're fighting back in a way that I'm not sure we feel we're doing here. We just feel we're trying to protect ourselves. We've got to do more than that and take the forward step.
Haynes, you said earlier you thought this was going to be very hard for political leadership. Do you agree with Doris that that's part of what the political leadership should be doing now, trying to find a way, in a very overt way, to get more Americans involved personally in some way?
Yes, I do, and I think there's a great
and if so, how?
There's a great opportunity here, because the climate I've described and what my friends are talking about, everybody knows what we're involved in. They knows well, this is different from anything we had before, and we are going into a period that we don't know where it's going to go, or how long it's going to last, or what we are asked to do. And our leaders have to tell us what we can contribute to right now, every day, some kind of commitment to the country's goodwill and good future. That's what we need to do, and that is not happening at the moment, but the climate is there, believe me. There is everybody, the seriousness of purpose, the anger, the fear, the frustration, all of that is a complex of emotions such as I've not seen before, but it's not broken in spirit.
Roger, there is a lot of polling data supporting what Haynes is saying about Americans, for instance, their faith in key institutions is up, in their political institutions. You have more young people suddenly saying, I want to join the Foreign Service or the CIA or the National Security Agency. How do you think that can be channeled? Do you think that we might see a greater involvement of Americans in kind of the public sphere than we've seen in recent decades?
Well, I would hope so. I think in the last decade there was an awful lot of self-involvement. And young people who I saw, whether teaching them or speaking to them around the country, really were turned inward toward what's for me next and how can I get my pile. This is really the first time that this generation has been challenged to do something for the larger community. But I see young people, I see young blacks, for example, who haven't quite changed gears. There was one who was quoted in the Washington Post this morning being very reluctant about the war and saying, well, you know, they called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. And he got a lot of applause. To put Nelson Mandela, whom I know, into the same category with these guys who kill indiscriminately is an outrage. And I know the fellow who said it. And people who are having that kind of reluctance really are people who misread American history. They forget that blacks have participated wholeheartedly in every war we've had from the Revolution on, and from every battle from Lexington Concord on. And this is a war that is indiscriminately against us and anybody who's standing next to us. The ground zero is not a segregated ground, and it's not just an American ground. So I think that with the appropriate leadership that Haynes is talking about and that Richard is talking. I think the president has a very tough task.
Michael.
You know, Woodrow Wilson once said that it's only once in a generation that you can lift the people above material things. And the tragedy is that in this country you sometimes need a crisis, God forbid. And the horrible thing is we're all as a people about to go through what I'm afraid is going to be in many ways a horrible ordeal. The only silver lining is maybe it'll connect us to history and larger purposes, and that's been really the best in America if you look back over 2 centuries.
You mean our ability to rise to the occasion?
Absolutely, and think of ourselves, you know, as Roger was saying, not just of ourselves. I mean, as a child, when I was a kid, I can remember being told, don't eat the snow because the Russians have put radioactivity in it. And I remember being terrified by the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a horrible thing for a small child, but in the same way, it's probably one reason why I got interested in history and politics and in a larger world, and maybe that'll affect children now.
All right. Well, thank you all 5 very much.